The most basic program everyone makes when they first start to learn a new language is called a Hello World program. All it consists of is printing some text, usually Hello World, to the console using the language you want to learn. That's really all it is. Usually you won't understand most of the program besides the output code, but it is used as a base for you to get settled and to help you learn via a very basic program. Hello World programs vary greatly from language to language, some consisting of only one line of code, while others many and many lines of code. Since this video is not targeted to any one language, I'm not going to talk about the similarities or differences. Instead, I'm going to talk about the input and output, the driving forces behind Hello World programs, as well as the basic information about text and data. Starting with inputs and outputs, they are what allow for data to flow in and out of your program. Usually referred to as streams, there are three default or standard streams of input and output: standard in, standard out, and standard error. These names are pretty self-explanatory, as standard in is the default input to your program, standard out is a standard output, usually to a console or terminal you're working in, and standard error is the default location for error messages. It's usually the same place as standard out. Beyond these though, there is still plenty of need for additional input and output streams. For inputs, you can use a whole host of things like keyboards, mice, CDs, files, sockets, Bluetooth, and websites, just to name a few. Inputs are in charge of gathering the data that is needed for your program to execute and run. For outputs, you can use a lot of the same devices that are also inputs. Even keyboards nowadays work as outputs, as their LEDs have fancy functionality. In a real-world use case, programs will read in the input from the input stream, process it, and then output something to the output stream based upon that input. The game Higher or Lower is a great example of this, as a user will input a guess to the program will then read that guess, check it against the answer, and output some text to the user, either higher, lower, or you got it, and then the cycle continues. Fundamentally, it doesn't matter where the input comes from, as long as we know where to start and where to end. We can read in any data from any source. Streams are just strings of ones and zeros, all in a line, flowing in and out of our program. But how do we get anything out of these ones and zeros? Well, now you get into the text and data aspect of this, also known as encoding and decoding. There are a few encoding and decoding strategies, and the whole process is a bit more complicated than this, but I'm going to simplify a little and only talk about ASCII. In ASCII encoding, we read in 7 bits, or 7 ones and zeros, and we use that as a binary number. That number is then looked up in the ASCII table, and voila, we have our character from our 7 ones and zeros. And if we string more ones and zeros together, we get a word. String even more together, and we get full sentences. Now, while I am simplifying here and not worrying about characters outside of the scope of ASCII like Chinese or Egyptian, the fundamental basis still stands. Input and output can be essentially boiled down to a few steps. For input, we create our stream with where we want to read our data from. We then read in the number of bits we desire. The computer and program language do some beautification to those bits to make them easier and more intuitive for us to work with, and then we have our input. Similarly, for output, it's just reversed. We open up the stream with where we want to output to. The computer takes in what we want to output, converts it down to binary, and then transfers it out to the output via our output stream. Again, a lot of simplification here, and it only deals with the more basic use cases, but the biggest concept to grasp is that all these letters, characters, and even images you see on your computer screens are just strings of ones and zeros to the computer. Often, as programmers, we don't even think about how this is all working, simply because our computers and programs handle much of the heavy lifting when it comes to transferring around words and sentences. It's something as programmers we can often take for granted, but it allows us to not only talk to our users, but also respond to what they tell our program. Now that we understand the input and output of our program, how do we actually do anything with that input? How do we even reference the input or save it to be used later on in our program to decide what output to give? Well, we get closer to finding out as variables and their types are up next.